Okay, so let's really dig into something pretty significant today.
Right.
We've got this stack of sources here, articles, reports, and they're all looking at one specific thing, that big drone strike deep inside Russia.
Yeah, the one on June 1st, 2025, it's definitely caught a lot of attention.
Absolutely. And what these sources are describing, it sounds, well, unprecedented for this conflict. They're calling it massive, unprecedented.
That's the language being used, yeah.
So our mission really is to dive into all this material, pull out the key details for, the how, what Ukraine says, what Russia says
And try
back.
to make sense of what it actually means,
Yeah.
right, without getting bogged down.
Exactly. Because right away, these reports frame this as a really big deal, major development. It shows how Ukraine's capabilities are changing, how their strategies evolving.
They mark it as a kind of turning point, Ukraine hitting Russia's military infrastructure.
Yeah. And what jumps out immediately from these sources is just the scale of it, the nature of the attack.
It's called a dramatic escalation, far-reaching. Those terms come up again and again.
And there's even a reported code name.
Spider's web, that's what the sources mention.
Spider's web.
Hmm?
Okay. And the method is, well, it's fascinating. It wasn't just launching drones from the border, was it?
No, not at all. The sources detail something much more complex. Drones apparently covertly transported and hidden
Hidden where?
in things like wooden sheds and trucks, surprisingly close to the actual Russian air bases they were targeting.
Wow. Okay, so think about that. They didn't just fly them hundreds or thousands of kilometers from Ukraine.
No, they seemingly got the launch points much, much closer, inside Russia itself.
And this seems critical, they launched them simultaneously.
Simultaneously, across huge distances. That's the picture painted by the sources.
The geographic spread is just huge.
It really is. Some locations mentioned are thousands of kilometers from the Ukrainian border.
Which specific regions are we talking about?
The reports name places like Murmansk, way up north, Irkutsk in Siberia, Ivanovo, Ryazan, closer to Moscow, even Amur in the Far East.
That's incredible reach. And the targets, they weren't just hitting random spots.
No, definitely not random. According to these sources, Ukraine was very specific. They aimed for multiple strategic air bases.
And specific planes.
Yes, specific aircraft types. The 295 and 222 strategic bombers.
The ones Russia uses for long-range missile attacks.
Exactly. And also the A-50 radar detection planes, the AWACS type aircraft.
And the rationale given in the sources. Why those particular planes?
Well, the reports state that Ukraine claims Russia uses these specific bombers and planes for its strikes against Ukrainian cities.
So hitting them is framed as directly degrading Russia's ability to carry out those kinds of attacks on Ukraine.
Precisely. It's presented as a defensive move in that sense, targeting the tools of attack.
Okay, but this is where it gets complicated, I imagine. Claims and counterclaims.
Absolutely. Very typical in this kind of situation. The information space is contested.
So what are Ukraine's claims, according to the sources?
They're pretty bold. The reports say Ukraine is claiming around 40 Russian military aircraft were destroyed or damaged. 40.
40? That's a huge number.
It is. They even put percentages on it, claiming this represents an estimated 34% of Russia's strategic bombers.
34%.
Yeah.
And a dollar figure.
Yep. The sources mention Ukraine estimating the losses at approximately $7 billion.
Okay, big claims. What about evidence?
The reports say Ukraine has put out video evidence and statements to support these numbers.
Oh, the verification.
That's the major caveat highlighted in these articles. Independent verification remains challenging. That phrase pops up a lot.
Why is it so challenging?
Well, restricted access to these military sites, obviously. You also have conflicting reports coming out.
And discrepancies between what Ukraine says and what Russia says.
Exactly. Major discrepancies. It's the classic fog of war. Information itself becomes a weapon, a strategic tool.
So can we verify anything?
Well, the sources are careful here. They say full independent verification of Ukraine's total numbers. The 40 planes, the $7 billion that's still pending.
Right.
But the reports also note that the video evidence released and even some Russian statements do seem to confirm that some damage occurred. Hits were made, aircrafts were damaged at these bases.
So not just smoke and mirrors. There was real impact, even if the exact scale is debated.
That seems to be what the sources suggest, yes. Some level of confirmed damage.
Okay. And Russia's reaction? Swift, I assume.
Described as swift and stern in these reports. They condemned the strikes, called them a violation of Russian sovereignty.
Did they threaten retaliation?
Oh, yes. They vowed to retaliate strongly. Standard rhetoric, perhaps, but firmly stated.
What about the numbers? Did they confirm Ukraine's figures?
Quite the opposite. They pushed back hard. The sources say Russia downplayed the scale of destruction, described their losses as limited,
And insisted their military wasn't significantly hurt.
right, asserted their operational capabilities remain intact.
Did Russia raise any other concerns?
Yes, one point mentioned in the sources is Russia stating the strikes endangered civilian populations near the targeted air bases.
Civilian casualties.
They raised concerns about potential collateral damage, yes. However, it's important to note, these same articles explicitly state that there were no confirmed reports of civilian casualties directly linked to the drone strikes.
Okay, that's a crucial detail. So, pulling back a bit, this spider's web operation, hitting deep, targeting specific planes, what does it tell us about Ukraine based on these reports?
It really highlights Ukraine's evolution, doesn't it, into what the sources call a formidable military opponent.
Capable of complex, long-range stuff.
Exactly. It shows ingenuity and growing capabilities. The how is almost as important as the covert transport, the simultaneous launch. It suggests a high level of sophistication.
Intelligence, logistics, execution.
All of it. And this sophistication is underscored by what the reports say about the planning phase.
How long did it take?
Ukrainian officials cited in the sources say this was over a year in the making.
A year. Wow.
And apparently it was personally supervised by President Zelensky.
Okay, direct presidential oversight for over a year. That's significant.
It really points to growing expertise in intelligence, logistics, and drone warfare, as the sources put it. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing.
And how is Ukraine itself framing this, according to the reports?
They're hailing it as a historic achievement, emphasizing their resolve and ability to disrupt Russia's capacity to wage war.
And connecting it back to Russia's actions.
Yes, very clearly. The sources are careful to note that Ukraine's actions, as presented in these reports, are framed as legitimate self-defense.
Self-defense in response to what?
In response to ongoing Russian aggression and repeated attacks on Ukrainian cities. That's the justification provided in the material we have, targeting the bombers that hit their cities.
And this all happens against a changing backdrop with international partners, particularly the U.S.
Right. The context of U.S. policy is important here. For a long time, under the previous administration, the sources remind us there were strict restrictions
on using Western weapons inside Russia.
Exactly. To avoid escalation, avoid a direct NATO-Russia clash. That was the big concern.
But that changed.
These sources detail a recent policy reversal from the current U.S. administration, allowing certain Western-supplied weapons for limited strikes on military targets within Russia.
Why the change? What prompted it?
The reports link it directly to mounting Russian attacks on Ukraine and a recognition that Ukraine needed greater latitude to defend itself.
To defend itself and degrade Russia's ability to attack.
Precisely. Degrade Russia's offensive capabilities. That's the rationale described.
What about the current U.S. administration under President Trump?
Yeah.
How do the sources describe that relationship regarding this?
They characterize the approach as more cautious and transactional, maybe a slower pace of aid, less vocal diplomatic backing compared to the previous administration.
But was there communication about this specific strike?
Interestingly, yes. Ukrainian officials confirmed to the sources that they did notify the Trump administration in advance.
They told them beforehand.
That's what's reported,
Yeah.
which suggests continued, if more restrained cooperation, as one source puts it. Still talking, still coordinating to some degree.
And what about international bodies? The UN, did they have a role?
According to our sources, no direct role. The UN and similar organizations have not played a direct role in authorizing or assisting Ukraine's military operations, like this one, inside Russia.
Their focus is elsewhere.
Yes, firmly on humanitarian aid and diplomatic efforts. The reports reiterate that Ukraine did not seek UN approval for this.
Sticking to their self-defense argument.
Right, viewing it as legitimate self-defense under international law from their perspective as reported.
Okay, let's talk broader implications. This has to send ripples, right?
Definitely. The sources discuss several potential impacts. For NATO, for instance.
Our allies reacting.
With cautious support for Ukraine's right to self-defense is how it's described. But they remain wary of escalation risks, always that concern.
Could it change NATO's posture?
The sources suggest it may prompt NATO to reassess its posture, maybe speed up plans for increased troop deployments or enhanced air defense systems in the eastern flank states.
Makes sense. And for Russia, beyond the immediate damage.
Well, the reports say it clearly exposes vulnerabilities in its military infrastructure, deep inside the country.
Could force them to change things up.
It may force a strategic recalibration, yeah. Things like increased security measures at air bases, maybe even a possible shift in offensive tactics if they feel less secure.
And the timing. You mentioned peace talks.
Yes, really significant timing. These strikes happen just before scheduled peace talks in Istanbul.
Adding complexity.
Definitely adds complexity. The sources speculate it could, potentially harden Russian negotiating positions, make them dig in,
But maybe give Ukraine more leverage.
or potentially bolster Ukraine's leverage. It cuts both ways, potentially. Shows strength just before talks.
So ultimately, these reports seem to agree this operation is significant.
They conclude it marks a turning point, showcasing Ukraine's ability to hit at the heart of Russia's military infrastructure.
And sends a message.
That Ukraine remains a determined and capable adversary, despite the length of the war.
And just to reiterate, everything we've discussed, the details, the claims, the context, it all comes from this collection of sources we've been looking at.
Exactly. We've tried to pull out the core information presented across these different reports and articles.
So if we had to summarize the key takeaway distilled from these sources, what would it be?
I think it's that this specific spider's web operation, as reported, really shows a changing nature of this war.
How so?
It highlights Ukraine's increased capabilities, their sophisticated planning, and crucially, how Ukraine, based on these reports, views and frames its actions.
That self-defense narrative again.
Yes, framing these deep strikes as a necessary response, as legitimate self-defense against ongoing attacks. That's a consistent thread in how Ukraine's position is presented.
Right. Okay, so a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over, based purely on this material we've discussed.
Given all these details from the sources, the sheer depth of the strike, the year-long planning reported, the whole international policy shift happening.
The claims, the counterclaims, the specific targeting.
What does this one event, the spider's web operation, really tell you about where this conflict might be heading?
It's certainly a lot to think about. A potent example of how things continue to evolve.